let's focus on the things that entrepreneurs have to worry about most. Economic conditions. Let's face it, more than climate. What caused this crisis? And what is this crisis? Because I think fairly clearly, it's not over. If you look at the performance of the biggest economy in the world, which is the US economy, you can see from this chart, which just looks at changes in quarterly GDP growth, that the recession the United States has just been through is not by any means the sharpest, deepest recession of modern times. But it's certainly the longest. We had 4 quarters of uninterrupted contraction in the US economy. So something unusual has happened here, but certainly in these terms it's nothing close to the cataclysmic 30% contraction in output of the Great Depression. Let's look at household wealth. I agree, not the most important of all things, but nevertheless important to many people. I did a little calculation of household net worth for the United States in relation to gross domestic product. And one of the things that's quite striking about household net worth measured this way is it really didn't change terribly much for most of the post-war period. And then, beginning in 1995, there were 2 extraordinary bubbles. One way of characterizing the crisis that we're currently in is that for about 10 years, Americans thought they were much richer than they really were. First because of dot-com mania, and then because of the real estate speculation mania. Those manias have been and gone, and now Americans have gone back to being what they were in 1995. Rich, but not that rich. From a global vantage point, there's been much discussion of whether there's been decoupling. And I've heard in the discussion that you've just been having an interesting implicit dialogue about the relative positions of the developing or emerging world and the developed world. Well, what you can see from this chart, which shows real GDP annual percentage growth rates going back to 1980, is that decoupling has in fact happened already. And it happened around about the same time that Americans began to hallucinate about their wealth. From the mid-1990s, the trend growth rate of emerging or developing economies rose relative to the trend growth rate of developed economies. And what's interesting is that the crisis did not fundamentally alter that divergence. It was a recession in the developed world. It was a growth slowdown in the developing world. And that seems to me an extremely important perspective to bear in mind as one tries to understand where we are. How did it happen? How did that great downward spike in developed world production come about? Well, of course, there are legions of people offering you answers to that question. The bookshelves groan under the weight of books on the subject. But I think I can make a reasonable claim to have beaten most of those authors to the punch, since my book on the subject was written before the crisis, in anticipation of the crisis, and was therefore available when the crisis happened rather than after it. The Ascent of Money is really a simple run-through financial history which also attempts to answer the question, why the crisis? I don't think you can answer that question in less than 6 parts. You've got to be very wary of monocausal explanations. They're doing the rounds at the moment, as I'll show you in just a second, but this seems to me like a credible answer to the question. Part of the cause of the crisis was excessive bank leverage. That seems clear, on both sides of the Atlantic. Then there was the misrating of toxic assets by the rating agencies. Without that, you can't really understand the excessive leverage on bank balance sheets, which was partly predicated on bogus AAA-rated collateralized debt obligations and mortgage-backed securities. We mustn't forget that there was a major error of monetary policy at the US Fed, which kept interest rates too low between 2002 and 2004. And then we must include in our explanation the role of a completely unregulated and very novel market for derivatives, things like credit default swaps. And that clearly played an important part in the crisis, most obviously its role in the collapse of the big insurer AIG.